Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be looking at labor policy.
Yeah, we're going to be diving into a document called Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise. Specifically, Chapter 18.
Okay.
It's focused on the Department of Labor and related agencies.
So kind of a conservative vision for what labor policy could look like in 2025.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And it's fascinating because it lays out specific reforms and really dives into the reasoning behind them.
Yeah, I mean, labor policy affects everybody, right? I
Well,
mean, whether you're an employee or an employer or even just thinking about the future of work, this is relevant.
Yeah.
So before we get into the nitty-gritty, what's the big picture here? Like, what's the core message this chapter is trying to get across?
Well, at its heart, this chapter is about sort of reclaiming the American worker as the protagonist,
Okay,
putting them front and center,
interesting.
restoring the family as the centerpiece, and promoting policies that actually support what they call family-sustaining jobs. And, they really emphasize that work is integral to human dignity. They even have this compelling quote from Genesis: "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it." So they're really grounding this in a sort of, a theological understanding of work.
Wow, that's pretty powerful imagery.
So with that foundation, what are some of the key areas where they're proposing reforms?
Oh, they cover a wide range.
Okay.
Everything from diversity initiatives to religious freedom, family leave,
Hey.
even Sabbath rest.
Sabbath rest. That's a new one. I haven't heard that one before.
Yeah, it's an interesting proposal.
We're going to have to dig into that.
Absolutely.
So let's take these one by one. Let's start with maybe what they call the DEI revolution.
Right. So the chapter really pushes back against what they see as the excesses of DEI initiatives.
DEI being diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Exactly.
Got it.
They argue that these initiatives often overreach and end up discriminating against conservative and religious viewpoints.
Okay, so not against diversity, but how we approach it. Precisely.
Okay.
So, for example, they propose eliminating racial classifications in hiring,
Oh,
ending things like critical race theory training, even amending Title VII of the Civil Rights Act
wow.
to focus on intent rather than just the impact of a policy.
Okay, so that would be pretty significant change.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Mhm.
Another area you mentioned was this pro-life workplace.
Right. So the chapter outlines a number of proposals aimed at promoting pro-life accommodations in the workplace.
Okay.
Things like ensuring equal benefits for pro-life support and clarifying abortion exclusions in employee benefit plans.
So making it more clear what those benefits actually cover.
Exactly.
Okay.
But of course, these proposals would have to be carefully considered alongside existing laws like the Pregnancy Discrimination Act.
Right. There could be some potential conflict there.
Absolutely.
Okay. You also mentioned protecting religious freedom in the workplace.
Yes, a major focus of this chapter is strengthening legal protections for both religious employers and employees, particularly when it comes to traditional beliefs about marriage, gender, and sexuality.
So in essence, making sure that those beliefs can be a factor in employment decisions.
While also ensuring that religious employees have reasonable accommodations.
Okay.
So it's a delicate balancing act, especially considering existing laws like Title VII, which prohibits religious discrimination.
Right.
Oh.
So a lot to consider there.
Yeah.
Now, they also talk about putting families first. What are some of the specific policies they propose in that area?
They have several interesting ideas. One is allowing workers to accumulate paid time off, even if they work overtime.
Okay.
This would give working families more flexibility.
Yeah, that's something I think a lot of people could get behind.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They also want to incentivize on-site childcare
Okay.
by excluding those costs from overtime pay calculations.
Interesting.
And they propose equalizing access to retirement savings for married couples, regardless of each spouse's income.
Huh. Okay.
Oh.
So kind of looking at it from a household perspective rather than an
Right.
individual. Interesting. Now, the Sabbath rest thing, I'm really curious about that. What does that actually mean in terms of policy?
Well, surprisingly, they actually propose requiring time and a half pay for work done on the Sabbath,
Wow.
with exceptions for essential industries and religious observances.
Okay.
The goal is to encourage communal rest and family time.
That's a bold proposal. I can see that being controversial.
It definitely is. And in fact, the chapter actually includes what they call an alternative view from within conservative circles.
Okay.
This view argues that the government shouldn't mandate Sabbath rest.
Hmm.
Instead, they should focus on removing barriers to religious freedom and let individuals negotiate their own schedules.
So even within this document, there's room for different perspectives on that.
Exactly.
Okay, that's interesting. All right, so we've talked about diversity, family, religion. What about the future of work itself? Like, how do they see the workplace evolving?
While they devote a significant portion of the chapter to what they call modernizing work. And this covers a lot of ground, including telework, the gig economy, and the definition of a joint employer.
Okay, so really kind of adapting to the way work is changing already.
Precisely.
Okay,
So, for example, they want to clarify overtime rules for teleworkers
makes sense?
and make it easier for businesses to offer benefits to independent contractors.
Okay, so acknowledging that that's a growing part of the workforce.
Absolutely.
Interesting.
They also want to protect small businesses by narrowing the definition of a joint employer.
Okay, what would that actually look like? Can you give me an example?
Sure, think of franchises.
Right.
They want to ensure that franchisors aren't unfairly held responsible for the actions of their franchisees.
Gotcha. So kind of clarifying those lines of responsibility. That
Exactly.
makes sense. Now, speaking of the future of work, education and training is a big part of that. What do they propose in that area?
They call for a greater emphasis on apprenticeships,
Okay.
especially those recognized by industry. They believe this hands-on skills-based approach is often more effective than traditional four-year college degrees.
So kind of a more practical, job-focused approach?
Absolutely.
Okay.
They also want to encourage religious organizations to get involved in these apprenticeship programs.
Interesting.
And they even propose easing restrictions on teenage workers
Okay.
with proper training and parental consent, of course.
Of course. Of course.
Yeah,
I mean, we want to be responsible,
absolutely.
but it sounds like they're really trying to shake things up in terms of how we prepare people for the workforce.
They are.
Okay. And along those lines, they also propose creating a new grant program for employers who provide on-the-job training.
Right. Yeah. They suggest a $10,000 per year grant for employers who provide that training.
Okay.
And they suggest funding this by redirecting existing higher education subsidies.
Oh, so they want to really shift the focus away from that traditional four-year college track. Okay, fascinating. Now, another big piece of the puzzle when it comes to labor is worker voice, collective bargaining, and unions. What's their take on all of that?
Well, that's a big topic, and they have a lot to say about it. They argue that the current system isn't really working for most American workers.
Okay.
And they propose some pretty significant changes, including exploring alternatives to traditional unions.
Okay, so we got to dig into that a bit more. But it sounds like there's a lot to unpack there.
There is.
All right, well, stay tuned. We'll dive into all of that in part 2 as our deep dive.
Welcome back. Before we jumped into part 2, we were talking about this chapter's vision for modernizing work, reforming education, and training.
Yeah, and they had some pretty bold ideas there.
Mm-hmm.
But we kind of left off on a cliffhanger.
Mm.
We were about to get into worker voice and unions. What's their take on that? I mean, they seem to suggest that traditional unions aren't really cutting it anymore. So what do they propose instead?
Well, one of their main proposals is to create what they call employee involvement organizations. These would be non-union groups that would allow workers to have a say in workplace issues, without having to join a traditional union.
So a different avenue for workers to have their voices heard.
Exactly.
Without maybe all the baggage that sometimes comes with unions.
That's the idea.
Okay, interesting. And they also suggest giving workers in large corporations the ability to elect a representative to the company's board of directors.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea, giving workers a seat at the table where the big decisions are made.
I mean, that could really shake things up.
It would definitely be a major shift in corporate governance.
Yep.
But they don't stop there. They also want to see more transparency from existing unions.
Okay.
Requiring them to disclose more financial information, limiting the use of union dues for political activities.
So really trying to hold unions accountable and make sure they're representing the interests of their members?
Exactly.
Okay.
And they propose some changes to the National Labor Relations Board,
which oversees union elections and labor disputes.
Exactly. For instance, they want to limit what's considered protected concerted activity by workers.
Okay, so what does that mean?
Well, basically clarifying what actions employees can take without fear of retaliation from their employers.
Okay, so there's a concern that maybe those rules are too broad right now?
Potentially.
Okay.
But on the other hand, they also want to make it easier for workers who are illegally fired for union organizing to get their jobs back.
Okay, so trying to find that balance.
Right.
Between protecting workers' rights, but also making sure that businesses aren't unfairly targeted.
That's a good summary.
Okay.
Now, another area they focus on is something called dues-funded worker centers.
Dues-funded worker centers. I'm not familiar with that term.
So these are organizations that advocate for worker rights but aren't technically unions.
Okay.
And the chapter argues that these centers often operate like unions, but don't have to follow the same financial disclosure rules.
So kind of a loophole that they're trying to close.
Exactly. Make sure that everybody's playing by the same rules.
Level playing field.
Exactly. And they want to give the Office of Labor Management Standards, which oversees union finances, more power to investigate potential wrongdoing.
Okay, so more oversight, more accountability.
Across the board.
Gotcha. They also take aim at something called the persuader rule,
Right.
which requires employers to disclose more information about the advice they get regarding union organizing.
Exactly. And they argue that this rule is too burdensome for employers.
So again, kind of simplifying things, making it easier for businesses to navigate these issues.
That seems to be the goal.
Okay. And then they move on to proposing some changes to the rules governing union elections and decertification.
Right. Decertification is the process of removing a union from a workplace.
Right.
And one major change they propose is eliminating the contract war rule.
Okay, so what does that mean?
This rule prevents workers from holding a decertification election for up to 3 years after a union contract is signed. And they argue that this gives unions too much power and makes it too difficult for workers to get rid of a union they're unhappy with.
So making it a little bit easier for workers to have that option if they feel like the union's not representing them effectively.
Precisely.
Okay.
And they also suggest allowing unions and employers to negotiate over certain aspects of national employment laws.
Okay. Like what?
Well, things like overtime rules.
Okay.
This would give them more flexibility to create agreements that work for their specific situation.
So kind of a more localized approach to solving those issues.
Exactly.
Interesting. Now, they also have some specific proposals for reforming public sector unions, which represent government employees like teachers and firefighters.
Right. Public sector unions are often a hot-button issue.
For sure.
And one key proposal here is requiring public pension funds to be more transparent about their assets and liabilities.
Okay.
They argue that many states are masking the true extent of their pension obligations, which could lead to problems down the road.
So more transparency with those public pensions to avoid potential crises in the future.
Exactly. And they also call for major reforms to multi-employer pension plans, which are common in unionized industries.
Right.
They argue that these plans are often mismanaged and underfunded, putting both workers and taxpayers at risk.
So making them more sustainable and protecting everyone involved.
Oh, right.
Okay.
And they also want to reform the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation,
which ensures private sector pensions.
Exactly. They propose increasing premiums on underfunded plans and giving the PBGC more power to take action against badly run plans.
So making sure that the PBGC has the resources to actually protect those pensions if a plan fails.
That's a good summary.
Okay.
And they also want to encourage more employers to offer employees stock ownership plans.
ESOPs.
Exactly. These plans allow employees to own stock in their company.
Right.
Which can be a valuable retirement savings tool.
So giving employees a stake in the company's success. Okay. So it sounds like they really thought through a lot of different angles when it comes to retirement security.
They have. And this chapter also delves into how they want to put American workers first when it comes to retirement savings and investments, particularly addressing concerns about something called ESG investing.
ESG investing, that's something I've heard a lot about lately, but I'm not sure I fully understand it. Maybe you can shed some light on that and what this chapter proposes in that area.
Happy to. ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance.
Okay.
And it's become a major trend in the investment world, but this chapter raises some serious concerns about it.
Okay.
And we'll dive into those details and their proposed solutions when we get back for part 3.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been talking about this conservative vision for labor policy, and it's clear they have some pretty strong opinions about how to put American workers first. Before the break, you mentioned ESG investing as one area of concern. Can you explain what that is and why this chapter sees it as problematic?
Yeah, so ESG investing has become increasingly popular in recent years. It stands for environmental, social, and governance. And basically it means considering those factors along with financial returns when making investment decisions.
Okay.
So for example, an ESG-focused fund might avoid investing in companies with poor environmental records or those lacking diversity in their leadership.
So it's kind of like trying to make investments that align with certain values.
Exactly. And a lot of investors do choose to prioritize ESG factors, even if it means potentially lower returns.
Yeah, I mean, I can see the appeal of that. You want your money to support causes you believe in.
Absolutely. But this chapter argues that using ESG factors in retirement plans is really problematic.
Okay, how so?
Well, they believe it goes against the fundamental responsibility of those managing those funds,
Okay.
which is to prioritize financial returns for the workers who depend on those savings.
So they're concerned that ESG investing could actually hurt workers' retirement savings in the long run.
That's their main argument. They believe retirement plan managers should focus solely on maximizing returns,
Okay.
not on advancing social or political agendas.
So they see it as potential conflict of interest.
Exactly. It's one thing for individuals to choose to align their own investments with their values,
Right.
but when you're managing retirement funds for other people,
Yeah.
the priority should be on getting them the best possible return.
Makes sense.
They even propose prohibiting the consideration of any non-pecuniary factors, including ESG factors, when making investment decisions for retirement plans.
Wow. So really going back to a very strictly financial approach.
Exactly.
Okay.
And their concerns about ESG investing extend specifically to the Thrift Savings Plan, the retirement plan for federal employees.
Right.
They're very critical of recent efforts to incorporate ESG options into the TSP,
Okay.
arguing that it politicizes the plan and compromises its fiduciary duty to participants.
So again, keeping it focused on those financial returns.
Exactly. They want to make sure the TSP is providing the best possible returns for federal employees, regardless of political considerations.
Okay. And they also suggest that the government should divest from asset managers who are vocal proponents of ESG investing.
Yes. They even hint at potential legal action for alleged breaches of fiduciary duty.
So they're not messing around.
Not at all.
Okay.
And their concerns extend to the TSP's investments in China as well. They want to completely prohibit any investment in Chinese companies.
Citing national security risks.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's obviously a very complex issue with a lot of geopolitical implications.
Absolutely.
But it sounds like their overall message is pretty clear. They want to keep retirement funds focused on maximizing returns for American workers and free from political influence.
That's a good summary.
Okay. Now, beyond ESG investing, they also call for broader reforms to the way pensions are managed, both public and private.
Right. Pensions are another area where we've seen a lot of headlines about financial challenges, and they have some specific concerns and proposed solutions.
Okay, what are some of those?
Well, they're particularly worried about public pension plans, which are retirement plans for state and local government employees. They argue that many of these plans are severely underfunded.
Okay.
And that could lead to some significant problems down the road.
Right. Taxpayers could end up being on the hook if these plans can't meet their obligations.
Exactly. And to address this, they propose requiring public pension funds to use more realistic accounting methods when calculating their liabilities.
Okay.
So making the true extent of their unfunded obligations more transparent.
Transparency and accountability seem to be running themes throughout this chapter.
They definitely are.
Okay.
They also propose reforms for multi-employer pension plans, which are common in unionized industries.
Okay.
These plans have also faced significant financial challenges, and they call for strengthening funding requirements and giving workers more portability with their pension benefits.
So trying to make those plans more sustainable and less risky for everyone involved.
Exactly. And they also propose reforms for the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation.
Which ensures private sector pensions.
Exactly. They want to ensure that the PBGC has the resources to protect workers' pensions if a plan fails.
Okay, so kind of a backstop to make sure those workers aren't left high and dry.
Exactly.
Okay. And it sounds like they also want to encourage more employers to offer employee stock ownership plans, or ESOPs.
Yes, they believe ESOPs can be a valuable tool for both retirement savings and promoting worker ownership.
So giving workers a more direct stake in the success of their companies.
Exactly.
Well, it certainly sounds like they've thought through a lot of different angles when it comes to retirement security.
They have. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into this conservative vision for labor policy.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground. It's definitely an ambitious agenda with a lot of thought-provoking ideas. Some might be controversial, but they certainly raise important questions about the future of work and how we can best support American workers.
I agree. This chapter provides a valuable framework for thinking about these complex issues. It emphasizes the importance of individual freedom, family values, and a free market approach to solving problems. Whether you agree with all their proposals or not, it's definitely a perspective worth considering as we shape the future of work in this country.
Well said. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and engaging. And as always, we encourage you to share your thoughts and continue the conversation on our social media channels.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.